While they do their little photo shoot there, we are now going to be turning to the role of the legal sector in shaping Africa's mining future. Now, this session is titled Legal Sector Contribution Towards Revamp of an Inclusive Africa Mining Vision Compact, which explores how ESG, business and human rights considerations are informing a more inclusive and sustainable network. So I would like to invite our next panel to the stage, and of course our moderator who's going to kickstart everything, Evangelista Nashon, who is a partner at Africorp in Tanzania, and our panelists are Hermanus, Aluka, Ligonzo, Mutuso, Dhliwayo, as well as Darlington, Muyambwa. But please put your hands together for our moderator, Evangelista, coming to the stage to introduce the session. I'm not the moderator. Another warm welcome for our moderator.
And a very good morning to you all. I can see the weather in Joburg is really weathering today. But glad to see that everyone is still attentive and as energetic. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to this session again. And just transitioning from the session that we just had, I couldn't think of a better really transition to the topic that we are going to have this morning. Allow me to also say thank you to the organizers for giving me such a balanced panel. I've been here since we started, and I think my panel has actually a very good balance of gender, as we are going to see when we start. Ladies and gentlemen, our topic today is legal sector's contribution towards the revamp of an inclusive Africa Mining Vision Compact. Now, as you heard from the previous panel, the Africa Mining Vision Compact was adopted over 15 years ago. And its key aim was to make sure that the impact or the mineral resources in Africa are actually used for the meaning benefit to African communities. And yet, despite all these resources that we have, still, the issues that the vision aimed at confronting remain with us today. At the same time, it is also very key to know and to actually realize that the global context keeps evolving. Now, the question is therefore not whether the vision is relevant. It actually is. Perhaps the better question is whether the vision in its current form today responds to not only these issues, but also these evolving issues that we are currently facing. And that is why today's discussion is very important. And with that, we are very grateful to have a panel that is with me here today that brings diverse but deeply connected perspectives to this conversation. We have Aluka Ligonzo from Partnership Leads for Africa at Global Witness, whose work sits at the intersection of transition minerals, climate justice, governance, and responsible resource management across the extractive sector. Her experience in law, policy, and stakeholders' engagement brings an important perspective on a broader goals and evolving directions of the Africa mining vision. We are also joined by Darlington Muyambwa, a leading expert in business and human rights, currently advising under the Danish Institute for Human Rights on responsible business conduct, just transition initiatives all across Africa. His work is on accountability, sustainability, and corporate responsibility, which offers critical insights into how legal and governance frameworks can move beyond principles into implementation. With him again is Mutuso Dhliwayo, who is a lawyer and executive director of Zimbabwe Environment Law Organization, and his work focuses on responsible investment, environmental governance, and accountability, but with key focus on access to remedy and alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Online, we are also joined by Hermanus, who is joining us online. And Lauren, sorry, I pronounced her name, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And Lauren's work, apologies as I go through her bio that just came in. Yes, Lauren Hermanus is a co-founding director of Southern Transition, an organization rooted in Southern Africa, working to unlock transformative economic opportunities in and for the global South. She's a researcher and a strategist with more than 15 years of experience working on sustainable development. Her work focuses on intersecting issues of infrastructure, climate action, and development. Her experience spans different sectors, working with different sectors and government, business, IGOs, and civil society. Her work has included on-the-ground economic diversification, experiments through Just Transition Lab, as well as contributing to South Africa's Just Energy Transition. She has over 15 years' experience on the area. So ladies and gentlemen, with that introduction towards our panel, allow me to start our session today with Aluka. And let me just get close to her so that it's easier for me to converse with her. So Aluka, we've spoken about the Africa mining vision, and the first session has actually introduced us, at least in a nutshell, of what that might be and what that is looking like in Africa. In a nutshell, can you tell us what exactly this is, what it aimed, its essence, and where we are?
Thank you very much, Moderator. So I'll just pick it up from where the last panel left it off. So it is a continental policy. The African Union Heads of State in 2009 realized that essentially Africa is exporting most of its raw materials, and there's a need for actually to curb Africa from being a primary exporter of the raw materials and to value add, manufacture, and benefit from our minerals directly. So broad-based, it's a continental policy. It's designed to transform the continental's mining sector. So a short explanation is that it is currently what I call the Bible, under which all the other policies that country mining visions, the African Green Mineral Strategy, and any other policy that is to be used is supposed to draw inspiration from, or supposed to actually draw a background from. So if you look at the mining sector on the continent, 30% of the world's minerals are actually found in Africa, yet we are still languishing in poverty. A lot of it is also raw materials are exported, raw. They are not valued on the continent, and a lot of that is we export the minerals, and then again we look for money to actually buy, the finished products. Yet we have geological advantage, and we also have economies that could benefit from these minerals. So if you look at it, the AMVs technically is supposed to break the cycle, whereby instead of us exporting our minerals raw, we need to figure out how to do value addition, we need to figure out how to do industrialization, we need to figure out how to benefit from our minerals on the continent, not exporting them and then buying them back. So the pillars of the AMV are creating a way in which we can be able to develop our mineral value chains. So what does that look like? It looks like beneficiation, it looks like refining, it looks like manufacturing, and with that it means you can create jobs on the continent. Africa is said to, in the next couple of years, have the most youth. Where are these youth going to work? Are we still going to export labor to other continents, and yet we have the opportunity to develop our value chains and to create jobs? Now, another thing is economic linkages. One of the panelists here yesterday talked about Africa having sufficient energy, but it's important to realize that if we do not integrate the energy sector and the mining sector, it means then we are not going to be able to create an opportunity to actually develop our value chain. So it's important for us to link our mining work. It's important for us to link agriculture. It's important for us to link industrialization and manufacturing, for us to actually process and be able to process our raw materials. Another thing is transparency and accountability. I think Darlington will talk a lot about that, but I'll mention something about sustainability and responsibility. We must be in a position to protect our environment, even as we develop, our raw materials, and ensuring that our communities benefit from these minerals.
Thank you so much, Aluka. So basically, what I'm hearing is that despite its pillars and what it wanted to achieve, some of it, we would say it's fallen short. Is that what you would like to say to us?
Let me say yes and no. Because yes, we do have the frameworks that actually are the background of some of these policies. A lot of the country mining visions you see, and which is now what we're calling implementation status, is that a lot of countries start from nowhere. And they want to create mining laws or mining policies. They want to revise or revamp their mining policies. And we have the African mining vision that they can always go back to and say, this is what the African mining vision says. It's a continental strategy that cuts across Cairo, to Cape. But yet, country mining visions do not adapt the tenets of the African mining vision. So let me say this, we are 40% into implementation, but at the end of the day, the politics also come into place. Do we have an opportunity to actually update, prioritize? Because now you're seeing conversations around critical minerals, and we do have an African green mineral strategy, which is now competitive because now we're moving into a digital space. So how are we going to then adopt a green mineral strategy if we've not even adopted the African mining vision and created country visions out of it? So we still have a lot of work to do.
Wow, perfect. Let me take you back a little bit when you mentioned about value addition. I'm hearing a concept of perhaps paradox of plenty.
Yes.
Can you share with us, and perhaps the audience would like to know, what do you think has prevented Africa from moving up the value, the value chain in practice?
Before I even answer your question, do you know, this is to the audience, that your cell phone today contains 100 different minerals, critical, that are found on the continent? Some, coltan, tantalum, copper, gold, diamond, manganese, and platinum. But at the end of the day, all of these minerals are exported in their raw form to China to create a phone. This tablet that I'm using was not made in South Africa. The cell phone you're holding was made in China. Yet all these minerals were extracted from the continent and are being processed outside the continent. So when you ask me the paradox of plenty, we have a lot of these minerals. Yet at the end of the day, we are not benefiting from the minerals directly because somebody else has to come in the middle of this to do now value addition. What I have to say is, it's sad that at the end of the day, we sit in these spaces and we have these conversations, and we do have the technical capacity as Africans to actually do in-continent and in-country value addition. But at the end of the day, we need to sit as a continent and figure out the geopolitics around it. We need energy to actually set up industrialization and manufacturing. We do have the minerals, but do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the political goodwill to actually put together in-continent value addition? I think I'll pose a question to the audience. Is that an opportunity that we can be able to do as policymakers to actually create an enabling environment for us to do in-continent value addition? So the paradox is the minerals are there, we need the minerals, we know what to do with the minerals, but are we actually ready to take the next bold step?
Wow. Thank you so much, Aluka, because ideally what you're saying is that despite the strength that the vision itself has, there are still significant gaps, right, between policy ambition that we have and the lived realities that we're experiencing at the moment. And I think this creates an important bridge towards what Darlington is going to share with us as well, around areas particularly on human rights, accountability, and responsible business conduct. Darlington, from a human rights perspective, do you think there's now, from what Aluka said, there's now a need, perhaps, to revamp the vision itself?
Thank you very much, Moderator, and good morning, everyone. I think the AMV has a very useful tool, one of the tools anyway, that was developed, which is the Private Sector Compact. And the Private Sector Compact recognizes that for there to be development, for there to be investments in industrialization, which are questions that Aluka has been posing, there is need for a clear role that private sector plays. And it is indeed time to revamp this Private Sector Compact. Because when it was constituted, not so many private players took a role in it, and it was done in a context that is different from what we are having today. Spaces like this you would find were dedicated possibly to just lawyers, but as you can see in this platform, we've got civil society, we've got a multiplicity of stakeholders that are engaging together and talking to each other. When the compact was designed, it was mostly from an echo chamber perspective, where we were talking amongst ourselves, possibly as civil society, but representing or pointing to things that business need to do. But this has changed. We have seen the relationship between civil society, state, and private sector changing and shifting over time. And because of that, there is a strong justification for revamping the Private Sector Compact, because our language and our conversations has really evolved. The other thing that has evolved, and I'm thankful to the panel before us, is the ESG provisions. These have really, in the last 5 years, changed. And the Private Sector Compact, when it was done, it was not within the same framing of the ESG as we see today. There have also been some developments that needs to be captured in our Private Sector Compact, and this includes the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises. These are recent, and they have not been captured and incorporated in the Private Sector Compact as we know it today. The other thing, or the other element that also needs to be incorporated is what Aluka was referring to, that we now have an Africa Green Mineral Strategy. So we just don't have an AMV, but we have an Africa Green Mineral Strategy, and this Green Mineral Strategy realizes that there is a sudden surge of interest in Africa's critical minerals or in Africa's transition minerals. So all of these things have not been captured, including the whole shift towards what some call the scramble for critical minerals. It has not been incorporated. So yes, and I believe the Private Sector Compact of the African Mining Vision needs to be revamped to include these contextual developments that I've been pointing up to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darlington. And I think now I would like to move to Lauren online. I don't know if she's able to hear us.
I can hear you clearly.
Great. Okay, so Lauren, a lot has been spoken by Darlington there around the revamping of this vision and, happening in the context of ESG, energy transition, and things of that sort. Maybe from your perspective and the area through which you work in, How can Africa ensure that this transition creates an economic transformation locally, rather than just simply reinforcing a cycle of extraction?
Yes, thank you so much to our moderator, to my fellow panelists, and good morning to everyone in the room from Cape Town. Thanks for accommodating me. So I think the previous two interventions here have really laid out a lot of the important challenges and opportunities that currently determine and also create the possibilities and space for a transformed future for Africa's minerals. But I want to focus in on one particular, I would say, an opportunity nexus, and that is the relationship between minerals and minerals development on the one hand, and as Aluka rightly pointed out, there the question of industrialization, industrial development, economic planning, and then on the other hand, to think about energy generation, and the development of Africa's energy networks to serve our people, to serve our communities, to serve our economies, to serve our businesses as well. And it's at this intersection that I believe significant levers could be pulled and mechanisms exist that could really have a transformative impact on the continent. And they come together in the green industrialization agenda. And this is an agenda that is really, I think, very well articulated in the African Green Minerals strategy. But it's an agenda that there are significant, very deliberate, very bold steps that need to be taken in order to realize it. And so let's think about the current reality and how this differs from what we might want to see happening going forward. So it's just too much of a common phenomena across the continent, across almost all mining regions on the continent, where we see patterns of enclave development, where you have infrastructure networks, energy networks, even water treatment networks that are in service of an extractive project, right? So in service of getting minerals out of the ground as cheaply as possible, usually on railway or on road networks, which are very often also privatized, which are not available for other use, so don't have any positive spillover effects for local economies, and then sometimes even to port infrastructure that is also privatized, that then also has zero positive spillover effects for local economies. And so that pattern of enclave development is precisely what we need to counteract. And this requires bold leadership from governments that are shaping new mining developments, and even governments where, you know, there's a re-engagement with existing mining operations in order to reshape these so that there are these positive spillover effects. And so we often, speak about this abundance of not just mineral resources across the continent, but also the abundance of energy resources across the continent, and this is in the context of the current global energy transition towards low carbon energy generation. Of particular relevance here is the abundance of wind and solar resources, which are really exceptional across the African continent. But the question is always, well, how do you unlock those, Because the sun shining above our heads, it does not translate by magic into economic development. And so if we look at, so we have those resources, which really could be powering our economy. We have natural resources, which we know there is a global demand, not only driven by the energy sector and the transformation of the energy sector, also driven by digital transitions, also driven by security as well, dynamics which are often have deleterious impacts across the continent. So we know that we have this global demand surging at the moment, a scramble for our minerals, but they're not really being stitched together in such a way that economic value is unlocked for us. And so, you know, we have a situation where less than 5% of global energy investment is coming into the continent. You know, it's if we look at renewable energy investment, it's, despite the fact that we're always positioned as this renewable energy powerhouse, it's closer to 1.5% of those investments. And we also know that when it comes to network investment, so that is really thinking about transmission infrastructure and distribution infrastructure, which we know is essential to building sustainable energy networks, and in particular, if we're thinking about networks that are powered by renewable energy resources. I mean, functional distribution grids are just essential, and we're not seeing investment coming into those networks. So the question then is, if our minerals are demanded, how can we leverage that demand so that we can shape energy investments in such a way that there are sufficient co-benefits for energy access on the continent? And maybe just another footnote on that particular issue. You know, when we do get to have this conversation, it's interesting that it's often framed in terms of addressing energy poverty. Now, this is an incredibly essential ambition. It's something which is in Agenda 2063. It's in the subcontinental regional frameworks as well. So, for example, SADC. This is across different frameworks for SADC, including the Just Transition Framework that's currently in development. But when it's driven from outside of the continent, the question of addressing energy poverty is often considered in isolation, and it's considered as a vulnerability alleviation issue, right? So it's a risk management issue. Now, that's one part of the story. But if we want to imagine a prosperous Africa and prosperous regions across the continent and prosperous domestic economies, then we need to bring conversations about managing vulnerability, addressing poverty into conversation with opportunity. And so it's about how do you leverage opportunity to lift the floor on vulnerability, and also to understand that lifting the floor on vulnerability is not just to take people from sort of one level of poverty to another level of poverty that's slightly less bad, but really trying to get people to a level where their vulnerability is such that actually they can engage in, participate in value creation and for themselves economic value capture. So to see all Africans as economic agents, as well as many other things, of course. But this is really something that when the continent is narrated from outside, when Africa's development is narrated from outside, it is absolutely glaringly absent that questions of poverty alleviation and energy poverty alleviation, just to tie it back to this very concretely, are not brought into conversations with the continent's industrial ambitions. And it's often actually used, I would say, as a smokescreen, so that we never really get to these much bolder, bigger visions, which really are about African governments, African businesses, African communities of different kinds, capturing more value from global value chains that are dependent on our mineral resources. And so, you know, this narrative of dependency of Africa on the world is, we know, really idiotic. You know, it makes absolutely no sense. There is interdependency. And I think that one aspect of raising our ambition is to recognize the extent to which the global economy and regional economies outside of the continent are deeply dependent on our resources, and that is a basis for power for economic agents on the continent individually, but even more so if we can pool our power and leverage that collective power in our engagement with the rules that sort of shape our opportunity space for economic development. And so this includes, as was discussed on the previous panel, international trade rules. It includes a whole range of international and foreign, also domestic legal frameworks that impact our economic agents. And so that, I would say, is a really good starting point, is to understand this interconnection between industrialization and energy and the extent to which these need to be really tightly coupled agendas. And then also, I think, an invitation for decision makers, policy makers across the continent to interrogate the extent to which our legal frameworks for energy are actually complementary to and enabling of our industrial ambition.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And you've mentioned something about just transition framework, which is under development. Perhaps flowing from there, can you, maybe the audience would like to know, and I myself, would you like to tell us perhaps how does that actually look in practice for mining communities and, African economies?
I would love to. So the Southern African Development Community, SADC, is currently in the final stages of formalizing a just transition framework, which is unprecedented. It is a regional framework for just transition, which takes the continent's ambition for greater economic integration and overlays that with, for economic integration, and overlays that with questions of infrastructure integration and a kind of mutually beneficial strategies for navigating the global energy transition, but very much, and I think this is really incredible, very much taking an integrated stance on energy, industrialization, and questions of sustainable development. And so this framework does something which I think is really incredible. And actually, as we today think about, operationalizing many of the very ambitious frameworks and standards that we have already accepted and developed across the continent, SADC is making some interesting suggestions about how one might seek to operationalize these frameworks across all African countries. I mean, we are a large and diverse continent. And so the approach that's taken is that there are general principles that are developed to allow policymakers to be guided in their domestic development of energy frameworks and just transition frameworks and all kinds of aligned and interconnected frameworks that are in service of a just transition, that come together within a just transition plan, let's say. But then in addition to this, what is identified is a number of priority opportunity areas that are very concrete opportunity spaces where a just transition can be advanced through both the complementary development of energy infrastructure and towards a sustainable energy system, and then also thinking about what the other complementary industrial or economic development, legal policy interventions might be to unlock that. So one example of such an opportunity is looking at the iron and steel value chain in Southern Africa, and considering how the transition of that value chain does two very important things. The one is to protect the value at risk as the continent is exposed to shifts in global markets, standards like, for example, in export markets like CBAM, which would be really punitive towards our industries as they are currently configured and reliant on fossil fuels. So it's a question of protecting local value add that come from business operations and from local value chains. It's a question of protecting employment and local economies. But then also it's about expanding the value that's created on the continent, and then also the value that is captured. So captured at the regional level, captured at the domestic level, and then captured at the community level that you mentioned. So communities that are adjacent to mining operations or other industrial plants. And so the way that this is then taken one step further towards operationalization is to say, okay, so if we zoom in on this value chain, where do we see that countries are already have activity, participation in this value chain, and how can we think in a complementary way, leveraging the different strengths, resources, capabilities, institutional capabilities, business capabilities, skills profiles of countries in order to map out a cooperation corridor that overall expands the value and then allows for a sharing of that value by participating actors. And so, this approach has identified, so they've identified several economic opportunity areas, and so they are relevant to different economies within the region, and really the idea is to take very seriously that for this global transition to land on the continent and to really benefit us, there's a need to take very seriously the multi-scalar nature of this transition, and its nature of being embedded in various other transitions and dynamics that are currently underway. And so, when we talk about a just transition, I think something that was really quite incredible that came out of South Africa's leadership of the G20 last year was to crystallize an articulation of what just transition means that is much more realistic, appropriate to a developing country context on the continent, but also in other developing regions like Latin America and Southeast Asia. And this is a whole of economy, whole of society just transition. So understanding that it's not just a technical issue, it's not just like one energy generation technology out and another one in. It's not a question of technology substitution, but actually it's a question of economy, energy interface reconfiguration. And for us on the continent, to realize our ambitions, it's a question of how does the transition open a window of opportunity such that we can advance economic strategies that have structural implications, that we are not reliant on the export of raw materials, but that also we look at those raw materials that we are currently exporting and say, okay, so what are the opportunities for value capture really directly connected here, but also indirectly? So how do we think really creatively about value chain upgrading and value capture related to these value chains? But something that I think it was you in your opening comments, or maybe it was Aluka mentioned, this integration, when you start to think about the energy industry interface, And you start to think about, so green industrialization opportunities directly related to, like, let's say, a particular mineral endowment. It's really important to also think about how the value that's created there then starts to interconnect with other areas of value generation. And I think one area that we already see governments starting to pay attention to this, and I think there's a necessity for really more and more collective thinking across the continent, across the region, is this intersection, or the interface rather, between sort of mineral value chains and value creation and extraction there for the continent, capture, let's say rather, to keep it separate from extraction, and agriculture. And, food sovereignty and food security needs to be facilitated, I would say, in parallel with our ambitions to grow and capture mineral value. And Africa is in a really unique position to do this because of our position in global geography. We are blessed with kind of complementary risks and opportunities that allow for strategies that really make us, I think, in the future, a food secure region. That requires not only ambitious planning and governance, but planning and governance that can consider the risks and opportunities related to energy, to mining, to green industrialization tied to mining, but then also to agriculture and agro-processing as well. So, integration is, it's an easy word to say. What it demands is institutional capacity and institutional capability. And on the previous panel, we had someone speaking from the AU about this necessity. And, to tie to Darlington's concerns about governance and transparency, I think when we
Lauren,
have... Oh, sorry.
If you
I can't see you, so I can't
we're
see you
really
trying to cut
pressed
me.
with time. If you can round.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Don't worry. That's absolutely fine. So should I finish the thought?
Yes, please. Just one
Okay,
line,
okay.
1 second.
Yeah. So, one of the big challenges when we think about transparency and accountability is the extent to which foreign actors that are operating on the continent actually benefit from a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability and institutional chaos. And so, when our institutions are bypassed in order to further, extractive projects, this doesn't only have impacts immediately and costs and losses that we can see affecting the most vulnerable people immediately, but what is compromised is our capacity to facilitate economic development and prosperity far into the future. And so that's what we're seeing with a lot of path dependency, where we say, okay, but the mining vision is this long, and now we have the green mineral strategy, and we also have Agenda 2063, and we sort of sit here and we're puzzled. Why aren't they being implemented? But that institutional incapacity is really implicated in our lock-in to pathways that don't serve us. And so building up institutional capability, empowering our local institutions is really, it's essential to all questions of economic development, and certainly essential to minerals-driven development too.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I would like to move straight to Mutuso. We've had a lot on ESG, human rights. Now, Lauren just finished around just transition. And the question that I'm seeing is really the question of implementation. Mm-hmm. Now, I would like to ask you, because you work in this area, Mutuso, traditionally, arbitration has focused more on commercial disputes. Now, given the discussion that we've been having around these areas, do you think it can actually evolve now as we speak to address environmental and human rights concerns in this context?
Thank you very much, Evangelista. Yes, I think it can and it should transition to begin to include these disputes that involve the impact that mining has in terms of the rights of communities, in terms of sustainability, in terms of human rights. I think, as you have pointed out, traditionally the focus is on investors and the dispute that they may have with the states. But when this mining happens, it doesn't happen in the air. It's happening on lands that are inhabited by communities. And as this mining happens, a number of rights are violated. The right to food, the right to life, the right to water, the right to a clean and healthy environment. And these are communities that are being impacted. And more often than not, when they try to have these concerns addressed, the state always argue that it is that right in terms of making sure that there is economic development for the benefit of the country. But is that the kind of development that happens at the expense of other people's rights, and in this case, communities' rights? And I think that's the major challenge that we are all experiencing. So indeed, mining is important for economic development, and now with this rush for critical minerals, because of the climate crisis, and as other panelists have pointed out, Africa is endowed with those critical minerals in the form of copper, cobalt, nickel, and lithium. But the extraction, as it happens on these lands, it is leaving a lot to be desired in terms of how communities are being impacted. Involuntary displacement, without fair and adequate compensation, without them being consulted, without participating in the policy and decision-making processes. And when violations happens in terms of the grievance redress mechanisms that are there, which at times the governments do not respect. So my view is that arbitration can actually come in, because when there are these disputes between communities and the investors, I think in terms of the disruption that happens to production because of that of lack of social license to operate, it ends up affecting production and the reputational damage as well. And even investors are also now taking that into account in terms of those conflicts that happen and making decisions based on that. So I think that arbitration could also play a role there, beginning to address those concerns that communities have, because at the end of the day, when they try to go to the courts, there are challenges that are there in terms of, one, the lack of skills that they may have. We have investors represented by highly qualified lawyers, and at times the communities are just there on their own. What about the resources that are required is also a big challenge. So I think it is important that arbitration begin to think about those issues. How can they ensure that investments are sustainable, they respect human rights, the environment are friendly, and ensure that when there are grievances, how do you ensure that the grievances of the communities are also addressed amicable? So I think it is important that arbitration and especially lawyers begin to think about how they ensure that these investments of their clients, they represent the investors, the mining companies, are done in a way that respects human rights. So there's no one who is opposed to investments. We know that this is important, and our countries are rushing to attract foreign direct investment. But can we attract investment that is responsible as provided for under national, regional, and international law? I think that's where the gap we have seen, that we just rush to attract investments, some of them that are not responsible. And we have seen some serious problems when it comes to human rights violations, especially those of communities that inhabit these lands. And more often than not, we talk about development. But people are beginning to question, whose development are we talking about? Is that development when communities' rights are violated? If anyone here has been to a mining area, you begin to see what we are talking about. We talk about development, but go to those communities. They're among the poorest. Even when you talk about energy that is being generated, it is being generated to somewhere else. But what about the community themselves? We talk about the need for this move to energy transition in terms of the climate crisis. But are the communities really interested in some of these electric vehicles that you talk about. So I think communities are questioning these investments and also the benefits that are arising. All they see are the costs that are associated with mining. And in lawyers' language, these are serious human rights violations, whether they're economic rights, social rights, cultural rights, and environmental rights as well. These are all being affected. So I think our clarion call is let investments come, but let them be responsible investments. Let them be investments that respect human rights and based on all those frameworks that have been outlined, including the mining vision and, of course, the mining comeback. It is one of those ways through which lawyers here can actually advise their clients to sign up to the mining comeback and ensure that mining itself and investments are done in a responsible and sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mutuso. I know time is almost up. I wouldn't say it's up, even if it looks like up. But I wouldn't let you leave without telling us a little bit about, access to remedy, which is an area you've really, really worked on. If you could tell the audience as well, what do you think it will take to have communities really have access to remedy? I think that is also very important for us to understand.
Indeed. So when we interact with mining companies concerning these issues that I have raised and that other panelists have also raised, the argument is that we have operational grievance redress mechanisms that are available to address the concerns of communities. But of course, we see the operational grievance redress mechanisms, but the question is, are these effective? Because when you go to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, Guiding Principles 29 and 31, they talk about what is called the effectiveness criteria that can actually be used to assess these grievance redress mechanisms to see if they are effective and are responsive to the concerns that communities have. So I think there are a number of criteria that are listed there that each and every operational grievance redress mechanism should be able to meet. Is it legitimate? Yeah. So when you go to some of those, you look at them, the legitimacy there, where communities consulted, they participate in coming up with that operational grievance redress mechanism. More often than not, you find that it's lacking. Accessible. You see, these are established maybe here in Johannesburg, but the mining itself is happening in Polokwane. How are those communities expected to access those operational grievance redress mechanisms? So accessibility becomes very critical. Then is it predictable? Can it be used with that predictability that people will be able to know that if we file in terms of 10 weeks, we'll be able to get the response, or in a week's time? We find that also problematic. Is it equitable? I think these are all important principles. Is it rights compatible? I think when you look at the UN Guiding Principles, they give a framework in terms of what a rights compatible grievance redress mechanism should look like. But when you assess them, we see that they don't meet that. Are they transparent? People talked about transparency and accountability here. Again, it's a problem that we see that is lacking. And are they a source of continuous learning and improvement? As people have pointed out, the standards, they are always evolving. And these grievance redress mechanisms should be able to reflect that. So if they meet up that criteria as provided under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, I think we can talk about effective operational grievance redress mechanisms. But as they stand, it's mainly just to tick boxes and say that we have it. But in terms of providing that effective remedy to the communities that are affected and impacted by these mining activities, they are not meeting that criteria. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we are facing as we work with communities that are impacted by mining activities.
Thank you so much, Mutuso. And I think that brings us to a very, very important question, with respect to the topic that we have today. And I would like, perhaps in a minute for each panelist to really tell us now, where do you think the legal sector now is currently not doing enough, to translate all these good insights and all these visions from the AMV into actually tangible, actionable, implementable actions? I'll start with Darlington, coming to Aluka, and then we'll finish with Lauren, if she's still with us online.
All right, thank you very much. I don't think it's a question of where they're not doing enough, because we've been sitting in these conversations and our language is very similar. I think what I would do is to encourage that, to see the private sector compact, to see the AMV and all the architecture as architecture that's designed to reduce risk and uphold the rights of affected communities. I think, and the legal sector has a role to play, especially to translate these frameworks into something tangible by including it in contracts, for example, because of their proximity to corporates and to industry. I think that role, needs to be intensified so that we don't just end up with frameworks that are not articulated somewhere, but there are frameworks that are articulated in contracts. There are frameworks that are articulated even in terms of grievance redress, as Mutuso was talking about. So I think that would be my parting shot. Thank you.
Thank you. Aluka, before I go to Mutuso and then Lauren.
For me, I think the legal fraternity plays a more foundational role. And to anchor that, I think there needs to be more on regulatory compliance. There needs to be more areas in which the legal fraternity can navigate complex licensing, compliance and reporting requirements, including issues around beneficial ownership and transparency, because that then dovetails into what Darlington was mentioning about the private sector compact. But lastly, also, I think it's important for us to strengthen governance and dispute resolution, because then at the point at which we are negotiating these contracts is when then we're able to manage, issues around dispute resolution, anti-corruption, things around compliance, and we're able to resolve issues, especially when Mutuso mentioned around land access, licensing, and interpretation moving forward. In that way, we're able to then implement the African mining vision.
Thank you so much. Mutuso, if you just...
Sure. I think lawyers play a very important role. I think as we have seen here, lawyers represent these mining companies. They advise these mining companies. So when they come up with these policies, I think it is our responsibilities as lawyers to make sure that these policies, the vision, the mission that they come up with, reflect that understanding of respecting human rights, and specifically community rights. So when you develop those contracts, are you guided by that understanding that these should be able to protect human rights, respect human rights? Of course, the responsibilities of companies is to respect human rights. So that should influence in terms of your advice on the understanding that by doing that, that is actually mitigating or reducing risks in terms of attracting investments, in terms of ensuring that when communities riot, then in terms of the reputational damage that your clients suffer, in terms of the legal disputes that may arise, that may end up impacting on the bottom line. So I think lawyers do have a very important role to play in advising companies to do the right thing, in advising your clients to respect human rights. And respecting human rights is a very good investment.
Thank you so much, Mutuso. Lauren, over to you if you're still with us.
I am here. Thank you very much. So I would say, yes, there's an essential role. I would say that, however, we need to think about laws and regulations as one set of levers and mechanisms that need to be seen in an integrated others, like finance and investments, for example, and like policy and leadership set by government. And so it's by the time that we end up with a clear legal dispute, we're often really in quite a lot of trouble that really should be managed a lot earlier in the process. So how can we make sure that there's a positive and say generative attitude, as Mutuso just articulated? And I really do think that the leadership needs to come from government institutions, from the executive. I think that leadership on minerals is not enough to come from a minerals department or a mining minister. It needs to be set at the very top and flow down. And you have to have capable institutions that can help to realize a comprehensive vision and really to avoid situations in which we rely on lawyers only when there's a kind of adversarial conflict, and really think about how can we have a better, more coherent, more generative interaction.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and really the whole panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll agree with me that they've been really amazing. We are leaving here knowing for a fact that the AMV needs revamping. That is not a question. And really, the legal sector has a role to play. And maybe because time is up, please give a round of applause to my very good panel, and thank you so much for your time.